What if almost everything you've been told about how Pompeii ended, the cause of death, the date, even how many people died, turned out to be wrong? That question sounds abstract until you sit with what the archaeology actually shows. Pompeii wasn't buried over days or weeks. The city, its streets, its bakeries, its people mid-stride was locked in place in a single afternoon and night. And the closer you look at the sequence of what happened, hour by hour, the more it stops feeling like a natural disaster and starts feeling like something that should not have been survivable at all. There is one account that survived the eruption. Pliny the Younger was 17 years old when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, and he watched it from across the Bay of Naples, from the naval base at Misenum, roughly 30 kilometers away. Decades later, he wrote 2 letters to the historian Tacitus describing what he saw. Those letters are the only eyewitness record we have of that day, and they are precise enough, times, distances, observations of wind and sky, that volcanologists still use them as primary data. Pliny describes watching a column of smoke rise from the mountain in the shape of a stone pine tree, the trunk vertical and enormous, the crown spreading flat at the top. Modern estimates put that column at more than 30 kilometers high. That image, a pine tree of smoke, is one of the few things about Pompeii that matches what people already picture. The rest of it is harder. Here's what the timeline actually shows. The eruption began sometime in the early afternoon. The initial phase was not a wall of lava, not a shockwave, not instant death. It was a column of ash and pumice raining down on the city for hours. The stones were light, some small enough to hold in a closed fist, and the fall, while heavy and disorienting, was survivable. Haraldur Sigurdsson, whose research on the AD 79 eruption was published in the American Journal of Archaeology in 1982, documented that this first phase, the Plinian column phase, lasted roughly 18 hours. 18 hours of ash and pumice accumulating on rooftops. 18 hours during which the roads out of Pompeii were still open. Some people use those 18 hours. The skeletal record and the distribution of bodies inside the city suggest that a significant portion of the population fled during the pumice fall. The ones who stayed, whether from disbelief, paralysis, attachment to property, or the conviction that it would stop, were the ones the ash eventually found. Mary Beard, in The Fires of Vesuvius, published in 2008, points out something that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. We do not know how many people actually died in Pompeii. The number most commonly cited, around 2,000, comes from the fraction of bodies recovered so far, from a city that archaeologists have only partially excavated. The real number could be considerably higher, or it could mean that most of the population escaped before the end. We genuinely do not know. What we do know is what killed the people who stayed. The bodies, or rather the hollow spaces left where bodies once were, filled with plaster by the archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli beginning in 1863, are frozen in positions that tell a specific story. Some have their arms raised, some are curled, some are face down with fabric pressed against their mouths, a last reflex against the ash. For a long time, the accepted explanation was suffocation, that people choked on the ash cloud slowly, and that was the end. That explanation is wrong in a way that is actually worse. In 2010, Giuseppe Mastrolorenzo and his colleagues published a study in PLOS ONE examining the thermal damage to the bones of victims found in Pompeii and in the boat chambers of nearby Herculaneum. What they found was that the pyroclastic surges, fast-moving currents of superheated gas and ash that swept down from the volcano in the eruption's final phase, reached temperatures of somewhere between 300 and 500 degrees Celsius. At those temperatures, the human body does not asphyxiate. Muscles contract violently from the heat. The postures frozen in the plaster casts, arms bent, knees drawn up, are the positions of bodies undergoing instantaneous heat-induced muscle contraction after death. Death itself, Mastrolorenzo's team concluded, was almost certainly immediate, seconds. Seconds. That detail doesn't make the end of Pompeii less terrible. If anything, it makes the hours before it worse because those people had time. The mountain gave them time. And then it took all of it back in less than a minute. Here's what nobody tells you about the archaeology of that day. There are things the records simply cannot explain, and not everyone agrees on the explanation we just gave you. In 2023, a separate team led by Lawrence Alapont examined a different set of remains and found bodies lying face down, limbs relaxed, not contracted, the kind of posture that points to a slower death. Minutes of suffocation rather than an instant one. Mastrolorenzo's team had drawn its instant death conclusion mostly from Herculaneum, a different town hit by surges that may have been even hotter than what reached Pompeii. So the people who stayed may not have all died the same way or in the same amount of time. There are also ash deposits in certain rooms that suggest some people survived the first surge but not a subsequent one. Hours later, which means there was a window, brief, brutal, where survival inside the city was still physically possible after the eruption's worst phase. We don't know who those people were, or what they did in that window, or whether any of them made it out. And then there is the question of the date itself. For over a century, the eruption was dated to August 24th, 79 AD, based on a single manuscript tradition of Pliny's letters. In 2018, archaeologists working in Pompeii found a charcoal inscription on a wall, fragile, apparently written shortly before the eruption, that placed a date in mid-October. For a few years, that inscription was treated as the answer. Headlines ran with it. Then later testing showed that charcoal writing in those conditions can actually last far longer than anyone assumed, which undercut the reasoning that the date had to be from just before the eruption. By the early 2020s, the Archaeological Park of Pompeii had walked the claim back entirely. Its current position is that every date besides August 24th is unsupported speculation. So the date that looked settled for 19 centuries was challenged. The challenge looked like a breakthrough, and then the breakthrough got reversed. As of right now, nobody can tell you with certainty what day Pompeii actually died. Here's the thing about Pompeii. It became famous precisely because it was so complete. A city frozen, a snapshot. And that completeness gave people the comfortable feeling that Pompeii was knowable. That the last day was a tragedy, yes, but a closed one. A story with a beginning and an end. What the research keeps showing is something different. The last day of Pompeii is not a closed story. The date historians have used for 1900 years is still disputed, walked back, and disputed again. The cause of death that filled textbooks for decades turned out to be more complicated than a single instant. The number of people who died, we still don't know. The distribution of bodies across the city still raises questions about who stayed, who ran, who chose wrong, and who might have chosen right and escaped into a history that left no record of them. Every few years, a new excavation opens a sealed room and finds something that changes the picture slightly. Each time, the picture gets more specific, more granular, and somehow more uncertain. That is not a failure of archaeology. That is what happens when you get close enough to something real. Somewhere under the parts of Pompeii that have never been excavated, there are walls and floors and objects from that afternoon in 79 AD, August or October. We still don't actually know. Still sealed. Still waiting. Whatever they tell us, it will probably complicate the story again. Want more stories like the last hours before Pompeii went dark? Subscribe. That's exactly what we dig into here.